Hello everyone, I am Uriah Heep, and this is my Literary Cafe. We bring you the Author's Matrix Great American Novel Series, where we do dramatic readings of popular novels. And tonight, we'll be looking at Chapter 10 of our current book, The Village Idiot by Dan Blanchfield. As you know from Chapter 9, Jake Holzapfel is back in Addison's life and has arranged for an interview with the Crumbly Village Times with his father, Lord Holzapfel. What good could come from this? We'll find out. So, without further ado, sit back, relax, and it's on to Chapter 10 of The Village Idiot.
Chapter 10. Addison made his way to the university that morning following the conversation with his mum, and felt he was nearly gliding above the gravel road the entire time. Was it possible to float down the road? Addison wondered as he made his way down the hill. Of course not. However, that was his feeling as he approached the university. The fall semester was drawing to a close, and Addison knew he had to organize the results of his research in a hurry before meeting with Lord Holzapfel. He met Jake in the cafeteria that morning and was informed that the meeting had been set for the following week. It would be in the morning, so Addison would have to postpone one of his final exams, but he believed that would present no difficulties. The exam was one of Professor Underhill's, so Addison reasoned that he must not divulge the valid reason for his absence. If he were to tell the professor the reason for delaying his exam, he might vehemently object. However, once the article is published, the professor generously would welcome him back with open arms, given the fame it would bring his students and himself. Addison deftly convinced Professor Underhill of his need to postpone his final exam, and was granted his request without any unnecessary questioning, for which he was grateful. All that remained was for Addison to organize and gather all the significant data from his research over the past couple of years and prepare for the interview. He spent long evenings at the university, hunkered down in the lab, putting together a cogent, coherent presentation, and spent hours rehearsing answers to possible questions that Lord Holzapfel would indeed pose. While the week before the interview flew by, it was like a year had passed to Addison, despite his being so busy in preparation. The day finally dawned, and Addison rose early and was greeted by his mum, still beaming with pride that her son would meet with the publisher of the most prestigious paper in all the land. She wished to prepare hot porridge with the fresh sewer water flowing generously outside their house. Still, she wisely decided against such a move, given the nature of her son's upcoming interview, so she deferred to him to prepare his breakfast. That decision was easy, as Addison was far too excited to consider breakfast. He gathered his documents in his satchel, kissed his mum on her forehead, carefully avoiding the oozing sores that dotted her face and neck, and made his way to the offices of the Crumbly Village Times. The Crumbly Village Times was located in the middle of Crumbly's downtown, in the most important building in the entire village, and on that point, everyone agreed. The massive stone building rose 4 full floors above the town square, where the locals milled around throughout the day. The date on the building, carved into the granite front, was from nearly 100 years ago and suggested the absolute staying power of such a publication housed within its mighty walls. As Addison approached the steps leading into the building, he sensed the historic nature of the meeting he was about to partake. How would history judge this moment? Addison thought to himself, as he carefully navigated the grand steps leading up from the street to the entrance. He knew the world would never be the same again once the paper of record published an honest account of his groundbreaking research. He was both humbled by that notion and deeply proud. His only wish as he reached for the door's handle was that his father had survived until this moment. He was already convinced that if his father had spent a lifetime consuming fresh, pure water, his untimely death never would have occurred. As Addison entered the building, he was escorted upstairs to the waiting area of Lord Holzapfel. Although he was early for his appointment, the publisher was not. About 2 hours had passed, and no one had greeted Addison, or even noticed him sitting quietly in the corner. The few people who passed him did not look his way, and the receptionist sitting at the grand desk at the other end of the room busied herself doing nothing in particular for the entire time Addison waited. At one point, another rather distinguished-looking older gentleman whisked past Addison, carrying a briefcase tucked under his arm, and was granted immediate access to Lord Holzapfel's office. That was the only person who had entered that office since Addison took his seat a few hours ago. Addison did not recognize that gentleman had just passed, but reasoned that he might be involved in the interview he so eagerly awaited. The buzz he heard on the far side of the room signaled that his time had come. The receptionist motioned to Addison that Lord Holzapfel was ready to meet him. Addison tried to steady himself as he rose from his seat, fumbling with his satchel containing the voluminous evidence gleaned from nearly 2 years of research as he stood up and walked across the room towards Lord Holzapfel's door. "Lord Holzapfel will see you now," the receptionist said in her monotone voice. Addison forgave her for not showing the enthusiasm this historic meeting deserved, given what this interview would mean to the entire world, as she was likely kept in the dark about Lord Holzapfel's meetings. Addison entered the magnificent office of Lord Holzapfel and was stunned by its magnificence. He had never entered such a room in his life and was speechless. Lord Holzapfel looked up from his massive mahogany desk and smiled the kindly smile of a gentle grandfather. Addison immediately noticed the sore on the Lord's head and winced. His white hair, or what remained, partially covered the grotesque oozing depression. Addison clutched the extended hand of Lord Holzapfel. After exchanging greetings, he finally noticed that the gentleman he had witnessed entered the office moments ago, seated to his right. "Addison," said Lord Holzapfel as he sat, "this is our science editor at the Crumbly Village Times, Sir Cornelius Bartleby." "Greetings, young man," Sir Bartleby said as he shook Addison's hand. Addison was taken aback that he might be interviewed by the science editor of the Crumbly Village Times. He had privately worried that Lord Holzapfel's understanding of science would be wanting, which might present a difficulty he could not overcome, as he explained his research to someone ignorant in the field of science. That initial worry subsided quickly as Addison withdrew his hand from Sir Bartleby and smiled generously as he returned his greeting. "Sir Bartleby will be conducting the interview this morning, Addison," Lord Holzapfel stated with authority. Lord Holzapfel said no more, much to their surprise of Addison. He had expected the distinguished publisher of the most prestigious publication in all the land would have wanted to know more about the research his paper was about to report on, which would likely change the world as we knew it. There was no mention of his son, Jake, which also surprised Addison as Lord Holzapfel's son had arranged the meeting. Nevertheless, despite Addison's curiosity about the meaning behind the Lord's reticence on the subject, he was excited to begin the interview, as he had so much to say. Sir Bartleby stood up and nodded to Lord Holzapfel, who was already engrossed in some other writing on his desk, and with a dismissive wave of his hand, the great publisher effectively ordered Addison and the science editor out of the room and never looked up again. "Come with me, son," Sir Bartleby said, as he placed his hand on Addison's shoulder to guide him to the door. The two of them made their way down the hallway to the office, where Sir Bartleby had plied his trade for the past half-century, and the two sat down on the couch across from his desk. The office was rather nondescript, Addison thought to himself, as he made himself comfortable and began to arrange his research on the table in front of him at the request of Sir Bartleby. "So you are a young scientist, eh, Addison?" Sir Bartleby inquired, and he sat back. "What do you have today that would interest our science readers?" "Well, Sir Bartleby," Addison quipped with an excitement he could barely contain, "this will interest all of your readers, I contend, and I say this with the utmost modesty." Sir Bartleby smiled. "Grand." Addison pulled out a synopsis he had written up last night and handed it to Sir Bartleby, even though he was somewhat surprised by the question. Hadn't Lord Holzapfel informed his science editor of the momentous subject of this interview in advance? Addison wondered, as he watched Sir Bartleby grab the paper from his extended hand. He had spent hours last night crafting this synopsis, and felt it successfully captured the import of his research in the most efficient manner possible. He attempted to use plain language so anyone could grasp its contents. After all, he reasoned, it would not just be the science editor of the Crumbly Village Times trying to comprehend his research, but the population at large, and he wanted to make sure everyone could understand it. Sir Bartleby placed the paper on the table before him and asked, "Is this it?" Addison was stunned. The editor of the Crumbly Village Times had just read the most important scientific document the world had ever produced, which, once it was known, would change humanity for the better forever, and all he could ask was, "Is this it?" Addison attempted to contain himself and replied, "Yes, sir, that is the essence of my research. Of course, I have boiled it down to its most basic principles in my synopsis, but there is much more to it. Shall I elucidate?" Sir Bartleby nodded. Addison spent the better part of the next hour handing Sir Bartleby papers detailing his research and carefully explaining page by page, line by line, until he was satisfied that the editor had grasped the import of his work. "Are you thirsty, son?" Sir Bartleby asked as he stood up, waiting for Addison's reply. "Yes, sir," Addison said as he wondered what effect his presentation had on Sir Bartleby. Indeed, he must have been impressed. Curiously, there was no outward expression on the science editor's face throughout the presentation. Addison wondered if the science editor of the Crumbly Village Times even understood what he had spent the better part of an hour explaining to him in excruciating detail. "Fascinating presentation, Addison," Sir Bartleby said, with his back turned to the naive young man sitting on the couch. Well, at least that is a reaction, Addison thought, having expected more. As Sir Bartleby turned around, Addison noticed the 2 cups of hot tea with steam overflowing their respective rims the editor was carrying over to the couch, and he was horrified. Addison was so impressed with his presentation and his will to persuade others that he hadn't even considered that Sir Bartleby would serve him tea made with putrid sewer water. "Here you go, son," Sir Bartleby said with a grandfatherly kindness as he placed a teacup before Addison. The stench was overwhelming, and Addison began to feel nauseous. He had not consumed any sewer water in such a long time that he could not stomach its existence anymore and was repelled. Did not this science editor hear a word I spoke this past hour? Addison wondered to himself as he stared at the tea set before him. How could he expect me to drink that rancid tea after I just spent an hour explaining in great detail how harmful consuming sewer water is to the human species? "Exciting research, Addison," Sir Bartleby said as he sipped his hot tea carefully. Addison could see chunks of fecal matter bobbing up and down in the teacup as the editor set it back onto the table in front of them. The rancid smell from the teacup drifted into his nostrils, increasing the churning in his stomach. He had not noticed before as he was so taken with his presentation, but Sir Bartleby's hand, the same one he had shaken earlier, was covered with open sores, the contents of which Addison witnessed dripping into his tea. It was apparent Sir Bartleby was of an advanced age, and Addison privately wondered how a man who spent his life consuming sewer water had lived so long a life. It was rare for anyone to survive into this 7th decade, but evidently Sir Bartleby had managed to do so. "Addison," Sir Bartleby began, "it is obvious you are a bright young man." Addison sensed condensation in his voice. "But, son," he continued, "water has been around for as long as the earth. Why do you think it necessary to study it?" The abject ignorance displayed by the question shocked Addison. Here was a supposed man of science, an expert who had been studying and writing about science for half a century, but now needs to show more intellectual curiosity. Addison was aghast. Addison sat back and took the opportunity of seemingly pondering the question posed by Sir Bartleby, to give him license to ignore the sewer water disguised as tea set before him. He privately wondered where he should go from here. He had just explained his research, and Sir Bartleby had heard nary a word. Was this possible, Addison asked himself, that a man so supposedly learned in the field of science, a field he had dedicated his professional life to, could be so abjectly ignorant of scientific facts set right under his nose? "I would say respectfully, Sir Bartleby," Addison began, "that what I have presented to you is the most important scientific breakthrough in the history of humanity. And I say this with absolute modesty, sir. I have spent the past 2 years studying water and its properties, and the effect water merged with raw sewer water does to the human body, and its effects are, quite frankly, sir, devastating." "2 years, Addison," Sir Bartleby said in reply, with none of the grandfatherly tone in his voice of just a few moments ago. "I have been studying science for 50 years, son." Addison sensed the alteration in the tone of Sir Bartleby's voice as he spoke. "You are a university student?" Sir Bartleby asked. "Isn't that correct?" "Yes, sir. I am in my 2nd year at the university," Addison stated somewhat meekly. Sir Bartleby let out a grunt followed immediately by a smile. "And this qualifies you as a scientific genius?" After firing that barb, Sir Bartleby reached for his teacup and slurped down some more of his fecal-filled tea, much to the disgust of Addison. Addison stared at Sir Bartleby, wondering what bile would come out of his mouth next, but said nothing. "You see, Addison," Sir Bartleby said, "this is not all new here what you are saying. I have heard all this before, and the real scientific community has disavowed themselves from this nonsense many times over my career. Please don't think you are the first pseudo-scientist to breach my office walls to convince me of something such as your synopsis." Addison now grew angry. He had never experienced a close-minded individual like Sir Bartleby in his life. However, as he absorbed Sir Bartleby's words, he reflected on the past reactions of his university professors, Dr. Underhill and Dean Bugg. He recognized that same Feudashin in them that was clearly possessed by the science editor. "If I may, Sir Bartleby," Addison replied, "exactly what pseudo-scientists have come forth to explain the properties of water in the manner that I have just done." Sir Bartleby sensed an impertinent attitude welling up in Addison, and resented it. "I have studied this subject extensively, and I say that I have never come across any other research in this area that even comes close to the discoveries that I have made, Sir Bartleby." Addison was determined to stand his ground with the science editor. Sir Bartleby smiled the smile of condescension, coming from one who feels vastly superior to another when that superiority is neither well-based nor deserved. He arrogantly sipped another bit of tea, making sure Addison noticed the bobbing chunks of fecal matter that accompanied the tea that slid down his throat. As he placed the teacup back on the table, he could see the turmoil rising in Addison and felt it was high time he quashed it. "Look here, son," he began, having dispensed with none of the supercilious attitudes he displayed so arrogantly just moments ago. Addison braced himself for more insults. "It is obvious you are a bright young man." Addison began to feel ill. He had never witnessed such abject ignorance commingled with such undeserved conceit in anyone in his short life, and he found it evil. He wished to end the interview, but Sir Bartleby had more to say. "There is no reason to waste your valuable time and effort chasing something so foolish as the properties of water. The scientific community, of which you are obviously wholly ignorant, has determined time and time again that the sewer water that all the world consumes is quite healthy for us. I see no evidence to believe otherwise." Addison thought he could not be more taken aback by Sir Bartleby's utter ignorance and close-mindedness than he was only moments ago, but that bar had been eclipsed. "I recommend you continue your studies at the university, but do yourself a favour and choose a different field of study. I am confident that you will come to express your gratitude to me for this fatherly advice in the long run." How could he utter those words? Addison thought to himself. There is no evidence. My God, I have just spent the better part of an hour explaining in excruciating detail exactly what he contends does not exist. Sir Bartleby rose and extended his hand to Addison. As he looked down at the hand of the science editor of the Crumbly Village Times, and his eyes were drawn to the open sores that covered its surface, all Addison could think of was that the very evidence Sir Bartleby claims does not exist is displayed right there on the back of his right hand, oozing pus even as he says it does not exist. That evening, Addison returned home after having spent the rest of the day contemplating his future. He roamed the village of Crumbly, lost in his thoughts and seeing nothing of what was around him the entire day. Upon his arrival, his mum was sitting quietly at the kitchen table, and in front of her was the meal she had prepared for Addison's arrival hours ago. It was cold and dry, which Addison was thankful for, as chunks of raw fecal matter were still present in the dish that awaited him. Adele seemed both resentful and fearful for her son that evening. She had expected him to return hours ago full of life and enthusiasm after his interview at the Crumbly Village Times, and the fact that he had not returned to share his experience with her worried her the entire afternoon and into the evening. "Son," Adele said meekly as he entered the kitchen and sat across from her, "I am afraid to ask you how the interview went this morning. I was worried when you did not return." "It did not go well, Mum," Addison said haltingly. Adele waited for additional information from her son, but none was forthcoming. Although she has privately shared her late husband's opinion that Addison was wasting his life in a foolish pursuit like the one he had chosen, it was her son, and she wished he would not be in pain. As the two of them sat at the kitchen table, she surmised that the interview had gone terribly awry, but had no details to confirm that suspicion, other than her son's demeanour, as he sat in a heap in his chair. Clearly, as a mum, she did not wish to see her son suffer. However, if his disappointment could mean him giving up this lunacy and embracing everyday life, she would be grateful. Cautiously, Adele decided it best not to broach the subject again, but wait until Addison was ready to discuss it. So she decided it would be best to change the subject before he slipped further into a depression. "Well, son, your semester is almost at a close. What are your plans for the summer session?" The last thing Addison wished to discuss with his mum was his university career. Although she wanted to be helpful, she could not have chosen a worse topic at that moment. "I shall retire now, Mum," Addison said as he stood up and lumbered to his room. She followed him with her eyes while remaining motionless as he left the room. There was nothing more to say, so she vowed to stay quiet, and she did. Addison returned to the university only a few days later to complete his final exams. The university campus seemed lively, while it was an unusually cool, damp morning. Many students were milling around, waiting for their final exams to begin and end their spring semester. As Addison walked onto the campus, he felt an uneasiness envelop him. He did not wish to think of himself as paranoid, but he began to sense that many of the students he passed to his examination room were furtively eyeing him. These students were strangers to him, so it was not possible that they would be staring at someone whom they had no interest in up to that moment. Still, that feeling of being watched and perhaps spoken about in whispers took hold of him. "There he is!" Addison was sure he heard one student standing in a small group remark as he passed. "This is nonsense, Addison," he said to himself. "No one knows me on this massive campus, save a few individuals. I am invisible. No one notices me." Upon reaching the Commons, Addison went to the cafeteria to satiate his growing hunger before taking his exam. As he stood in line, he heard more whispers. He was sure that those were directed at himself. He turned around without warning to see who the offending party might be, but everyone looked elsewhere and was quiet, which only elevated his growing paranoia. After purchasing his meal, Addison swiftly sat in the back of the cafeteria. He felt hidden from the other students in the room, which pleased him as he ate his mutton. "Addison!" he heard shouted from a distance. Of course, it was Jake again, seemingly determined to ruin another meal. Addison did not look up as if he had not heard Jake's voice from afar. That did not deter Jake, and he ambled to the back of the cafeteria, mutton in hand, to join him. He plopped himself down at Addison's table and smiled that grimly mischievous smile he had perfected over the years, and Addison did his best to ignore him. "How's tricks?" Jake said as he munched on his meal. Addison did not look up, and Jake sensed he was unwelcome at this table, which he was most certainly. "I have an exam in a moment, Jake," Addison finally said, "and I need to finish my mutton and head off to class, so if you don't mind, I do not have time for trivialities just now." Addison desperately tried not to be mean to Jake, but it was difficult. "Have it your way, chum," Jake said as he scooped up his meal and prepared for his exit. "It will be a heck of a day, Addison," he continued, grinning from ear to ear as he turned away. If Addison could have recognized evil walking the floor, it would have been in the form of Jake Holzapfel as he scurried away, glad-handing students as he fled the cafeteria, barely able to contain his glee. Having successfully dispatched that miserable Jake Holzapfel, Addison gave him no further thought and swiftly swallowed his remaining mutton before gathering his meager belongings and taking off to his final semester exam. He knew he had prepared properly for the exam, especially with the added time allotted by his professor, and he was supremely confident as he made his way out of the cafeteria. As he passed the final table before meeting the exit, he turned and saw a copy of the Crumbly Village Times folded over neatly sitting atop the tabletop next to a half-eaten meal. Much to his eternal horror, his glance was enough to spy a photograph of himself on the front page of the newspaper of record. He turned white-hot as he tried to focus. He could barely maintain what little composure he could muster as he read the title beneath his photograph, "The Village Idiot. Why Amateurs Should Not Dabble in the Sciences," by Sir Cornelius Bartleby, science editor of the Crumbly Village Times.
So, Addison has his interview with the Crumbly Village Times, and Jake Holzapfel wins. It was all a setup. Addison met the press, the massive ignorance, the deceit, the dishonesty, and paid dearly for it. Thus ends Chapter 10 of The Village Idiot. Next time, tune in for Chapter 11. And where does Addison Way go from here? We shall find out. Meanwhile, we will sign off. We say goodbye, good luck, and we'll see you next time on the Author's Matrix Great American Novel Series. I am Uriah Heep, and this is my Literary Cafe. We'll see you next time. Good night.